Welcome to Talking Industrial Automation, a podcast where you get to know the people who make modern industrial automation possible. You will get to hear from CSIA system integrators and industry partners to get a better understanding of how they help their clients solve process challenges and how they've earned success in their careers. Along the way, we will touch on system integration best practices, technology, trends, and challenges. Whether you are a manufacturer, end user, supplier, or system integrator, you will enjoy the insights these industry professionals bring to this podcast. Let's get started. Hi, my name is Lisa Richter, the host of Talking Industrial Automation, a podcast where you get to know the people who make modern industrial automation and processing possible. In today's episode, we're talking industrial automation with Andrew Thomas, who is founder and inventor of the technology powering Skkynet. With over 3 decades in process control, system integration, and software development of real-time data communication systems, Andrew brings intimate knowledge of Skynet's products and services, development and strategic planning, and a broad, fundamental understanding of the business drivers affecting the company. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad to be here.
For starters, why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in industrial data communications?
In university, I did a master's in machine intelligence. So it was kind of natural for me to take a job a couple of years after graduation in a company that specialized in expert system control for heavy industry. As part of that, this was back in the day before OPC and before standardization of any sort, really. We had to wear a lot of hats. So I was a developer at that company, a FAE, a system integrator, and we kept running into the same problems over and over again, which were we needed to be able to communicate amongst different process areas reliably to deliver that data to management or the process engineer. And that kind of communication didn't exist. And so we had to invent it. So I would say that I got involved in the industrial data communications because it was a necessity at that time for anything to do with industrial that was more broadly scoped than a single PC.
How do you explain to lay people what you do?
I tell them the truth, and then when their eyes roll, then I try to explain. We make industrial communication software for real-time control systems. For example, imagine something like a wind turbine sitting on a hill out in the middle of nowhere, nobody's around, but yet you still need to be able to control that. You still need to be able to monitor that. You need some mechanism for communicating all of the information to and from that wind turbine. We supply that mechanism. We supply the software that allows you to communicate with the turbine, bring that back to a control center where a human can interact with the turbine, even where an algorithm can interact with the turbine. And that same problem occurs over and over again in industrial control everywhere.
So tell me a little bit more about the evolution of Skkynet. I assume it was like you in a garage somewhere. That's how you started. And then you just sort of scaled up from there. Tell me the story.
It wasn't a garage. It was an upstairs office.
Okay. Your parents' basement?
No, not that. What happened? It's an interesting story, actually. I mentioned that I'd worked for a company doing expert systems control. After leaving that company, actually, somebody that I met at the company, who was one of the system integration engineers at the company, we went into business together as consultants. In fact, in the area of industrial communications, specifically because there were a lot of people who needed that at the time. So we formed at that time a company called Cogent Real Time Systems. And as part of our work as integrators, we developed software to solve the problems that we needed to solve. Again, in fact, twice. We discovered that there was enough need for the software in the market that we could formalize it, we could turn it into a packaged product, and we could make that available to everybody else in the industry. A lot of what we had learned was broadly applicable. And so we moved effectively from a integrator, a consultancy, into a developer with the goal of making industrial data communications, simple, reliable, and secure. Although I have to admit that the secure part came later. At the time, nobody looked at security as an important aspect of controls, but it is now. Because we had been in that position of being an integrator, we wanted to make the tools that we would have liked to have at the time when we were doing those integration projects. So we look at that software from the view of both as a developer, what can we do, but also as a user because we've been in those shoes as well.
Tell me a little bit about the actual scaling of it. So you started out one or two guys. What year did you start?
1995.
Okay, so about 26 years ago, something like that?
28.
And 28. Did you go like gangbusters? Tell me a little bit about the actual evolution of the company itself.
It was a slow start. I mean, we started off, like I said, as integrators. It took a while for us to realize that there was a software development opportunity there. We, in fact, chose to work in what I guess would be considered real time. So deterministic real-time systems. And so we were not focusing on deployment in Windows. We were looking at real-time versions of Linux, real-time QNX. And that market segment looked promising back in 1995, but time did not favor it, quite honestly. It turned out that hard real-time, the deterministic real-time is a very small segment of the actual market. And so we bet on the wrong horse in that sense. And it took us a while to turn that around and realize that what we really wanted to be working on is the Windows or the juncture between Windows and some of the real-time operating systems. And so once we turned that around, then we started to move. So I'd say that it took a little while to get going. It wasn't an immediate meteoric rise.
So tell me a little bit about some of the problems that your customers are facing that presumably you're solving.
So over time, we've been doing this a while. We've been seeing a shift from isolated systems to centralized control and to cloud-connected systems. And that shift continues. We still see plants that are isolated, but as time moves on, they want to bring in more and more information from abroad or provide that information to cloud systems. And with that comes a security issue. Because as soon as you start trying to set up networks to move your data around, you introduce security concerns that you didn't have before. And the industrial protocols that people often have installed are not created for this scenario. The reality is that if you look at something like OPC, Classic, or UA, they're server client architectures. They weren't intended to meet the security requirements of exporting data from an OT network into a IT network or into a cloud system. And some of the standard ideas on how to provide security, like the Purdue model, they're speed bumps, but they're not really strong protection now against exploits in systems. So another problem is that we're seeing is the move from OPC Classic to OPC UA. OPC Classic had since 1997 to really get entrenched in the market. OPC UA had a slow start as well. One of the specs, at least the spec that most people work on, was introduced in 2012, but even now we're seeing some traction in the marketplace. But that whole shift is happening slowly because those people who are invested in older systems don't want to just tear it all out and reinvest all the money into new systems. So, we want to have a mechanism for gradually shifting from OPC Classic to OPC UA, and that's part of what we do. Even as that shift is taking place, we're seeing MQTT pop up. So MQTT is also not new. It dates back to 1999, I believe. But it never really had any traction in industrial control because nobody really recognized the value that it brought to the table, frankly. So now we're seeing MQTT come in. MQTT is a very simple protocol, but it's simplistic. And you can read simplistic to mean deficient. And so now we're seeing also Sparkplug coming in as another protocol built on top of MQTT to deal with some of those deficiencies. And so now where we had one protocol, OPC Classic, we now have three. And our customers need to decide what to do about that. What do they choose when they're putting in new products, when they're putting in new hardware? How do they make that decision? So part of our goal is to protect them from the consequences of those decisions by supporting all the protocols that are out there, whether, OPC Classic, UA, MQTT, various database and historian protocols. We protect or future-proof those decisions so that the customer doesn't have to worry quite so much about what they decide today.
Where do you see the industry going in regards to data connectivity?
I touched on this a little bit. I mean, we used to have data connectivity used to be all the way from the PC to the monitor, and then we had LANs introduced, and we had multiple computers talking to one another, and then we had plants with different plant areas, where the whole plant areas were talking to one another. And now we're seeing global communication where enterprises have distinct plants in different countries, but they want to centrally manage and operate those plants, or they have operations in various places, but they want to centralize the information in a cloud service like Azure or AWS. So there is an additional communication requirement, a data connectivity requirement that didn't used to be there. And different protocols are required for those. So we're seeing, I think, a shift in requirements as far as what's connected, but also in the protocols that are being used to make those connections. A second thing we're seeing with data connectivity is the goal of especially larger customers of sharing their data with third parties. So we have big customers who are, say, producing chemicals, and they want to share some of their production information either with their customers who are waiting for those deliveries or with their suppliers who are providing raw materials so that they can make their manufacturing more efficient, to introduce just-in-time kinds of operation. But for that, they need real-time or near real-time sharing of information. That desire to share comes along with a fear of exploitation. There are two fears there. One is, am I exposing my network to these third parties, which I don't want to do, or am I exposing information I didn't want to expose to those third parties? And so, again, we provide mechanisms to ensure that the networking does not produce an exploit, and also to ensure that information that should not get to the third party does not get to the third party. And of course, everybody's using cloud tools now. One of the biggest things that we're seeing is adoption of Azure for the data pipelines, the data storage, the data lakes, the large-scale big data analytics, AI applications, and all of that's happening in the cloud. All of the real innovation around analytics is no longer being done to be installed on a local area network. It's now being done to be installed in the cloud, and the expectation is that the data owner will export that data to the cloud and have the analytics done there. And so part of what we do, again, is to make that process achievable and secure, given the security stance that the data owner needs to take. And there are both just best practice, but also to a certain extent, mandatory security postures that they need to take. And we need to work within those and yet provide that path to the cloud.
OMG. Can you believe it's the middle of the year already? I find that, well, shocking. On the upside, it means I can offer you something special if one of your goals is to join CSIA. And why wouldn't you? This global community has so much to offer SIs, from best practices to certification, professional development, and even access to professional services experts, including insurance, financial, and legal, who understand the SI's unique business needs. For partner members, CSIA offers an ecosystem to grow your SI programs, understand your customers' pain points, monitor industry trends, and share your thought leadership. Best of all, CSIA is a soft place to land. By that, I mean it is a community of like-minded people who are willing to share, commiserate, and celebrate your wins, your losses, and your vision. So what are you waiting for? Oh, wait, you're probably waiting for my special offer. Here it is. For the months of July and August, membership dues and all Industrial Automation Exchange upgrades and packages are half price. And no, this is not half off like I am crazy Jimmy yelling, everything must go. It's really just because CSIA prorates its dues, but boy, that lacks excitement, doesn't it? To find out more, visit www.controlsys.org/shine. Wait, maybe I should do the crazy Jimmy route after all. What would you say are the advantages of connecting OT to IT?
Well, I think the obvious one is just timely access to information. Going back again to the early days, I remember working with a company where the connection between IT and OT was crayon on handtells. Literally, somebody would hand a piece of handtell with a crayon writing on it, and that was the production target for the next 5 hours. That worked. I mean, it was enough in that case, but It is prone to human error. It's slow. The information is complete. A lot more could be learned if we move from crayon net to an actual network. There's more capability in planning and resource management, safety monitoring, analytics, fault prediction, all the things that we expect now from a modern control system are not there if you don't have this connection. It's reasonable to say that not everybody needs up to the second or up to the millisecond access to that data. But at the same time, if you don't have to wait until the end of a shift or the end of the day to perform your analytics, you're still way ahead of the game.
On the opposite side, what are the challenges?
I would say there are three. There's an availability challenge, a security challenge, and a reliability challenge that all have to be met, but they're all intertwined. So availability would be the presentation of the data to the consumer who needs it in the form that they need it. And so that consists of not only a networking problem, but also protocol translation problem. The consumer of the data might be expecting OPC-DA. The producer might be generating Modbus, or might be producing OPC-UA or MQTT. So we need to be able to deliver the data in a way that it can be consumed. And that's not necessarily a one protocol for delivery. It's many. There are many users. Each of them has their own expectations. We need to meet them all. There's obviously a security issue. We need to be able to ensure that in the process of delivering that data, both in the protocol and in the network, we don't open up an opportunity for attack on the OT network. But the choice of protocol, the availability question, affects the security question. If you choose a particular protocol, that determines your network topology to some degree. You can't just choose a security topology and then say, and I'm going to use this protocol, because that's not going to work. They don't necessarily fit together. So you may end up with a mix of protocols in order to meet both your availability requirement and your security requirement. Then on top of that, there's a reliability problem. And that is the question of, what do I do if I have a network break? How do I recover data from the period during which my network was down? Can I do some kind of a store and forward? Can I perform some historical data recovery? And that is not available in all protocols. And it's not available to certain security postures because, like a lot of other things, historians typically are servers and they expect the client to connect in. And so how do I get my data into a historian without opening up a firewall port that then exposes my OT network to attack?
What are some of the best practices when connecting OT to IT?
I would say first and foremost, the network should treat one another as hostile. And not in the sense that the OT workers are hostile to the IT workers, but the networks are hostile. It should not be possible to compromise one network if the other network is compromised. And that goes in both directions. We often hear about OT being protected from IT, but IT should be protected from OT as well. There's no reason that either one should be exposed to the other. That means in practice that those two networks should not be connected. They should not have any services listening on open firewall ports on either of those networks. They should be rendezvousing through a DMZ and through some kind of a broker or a mechanism whereby neither one of them has to open up the firewall ports in order to get data from the other. The number two, I would say, is that OT should never be connected to the internet, not directly nor indirectly. And that flies in the face of one of the desires, that is to get data to a cloud. How do you get data to a cloud if you're not connected to the internet? So we hear people say, well, use a proxy. But a proxy is a connection to the internet. It just happens to go through a middleman to get there. And the problem with connecting OT to the internet is if there is a compromise in OT, like an infected USB stick, for example, other than a network attack, once the compromise is in OT, if there's a connection to the internet, now that virus or whatever it is in the OT system can now download additional payloads. It can exfiltrate information. It can start a reverse terminal so that somebody can actually get in and start snooping around within the OT network. So no connection is a good connection in OT. So in order to satisfy that requirement and still be able to get data to the cloud, again, you need that DMZ. You need a mechanism that is designed for the purpose of moving that data to the cloud without exposing the OT network. Just sort of to emphasize a point, that means VPNs are not an answer. Routers with firewalls are not an answer. you need a different mechanism for that.
What protocols are people using, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages?
Well, I covered them sort of, I've talked about them. The biggest installed base is OPC Classic. It's had the longest time to get into the market. It's fast, it's reliable, it's easy to set up. The problem is that it doesn't have a good network mechanism. The DCOM is terrible. I think that there isn't a person on earth who would voluntarily support DCOM. The security posture of a DCOM system is generally very weak because most people just open everything wide open just to get it working. And then they don't try to shut it down after that. And so the security is terrible. So on a local machine, OPC Classic is a great tool, but it does not do well in a networked environment. It is unacceptable for a data sharing environment where you want to get off the OT network. OPC UA is better. It's a better security posture. It'll run on anything. It's not tied to Windows. It's not tied to DCOM. It has a much better data model. But again, it's a server client architecture. If you want to share your data outside the OT network, you need to pierce the firewall in order to do that. And that is still an attack surface. The other problem, I guess, with UA is it's complex. It's being only 10 years old. It's relatively new to the market. And so there are still problems with interoperability amongst OPC UA tools, although those are getting much, much better over time. That was a real concern 5 years ago. It's much less of a concern now. I would say that the big problem with the OPC UA is it just wasn't built as a mechanism for sharing data outside the IT network. So we've seen MQTT pop up, and MQTT solves that problem. How do I get my data out on my OT network without exposing my OT network to attack? And so the way to do that would be to put an MQTT broker on a DMZ, send the data out via MQTT, have any consumers rendezvous with the MQTT broker. That's a better security stance than what either of the OPC protocols gives you, but you end up with some weaknesses as a result. MQTT, like I said, is simple by being simplistic. It has a number of failure modes that are built right into the protocol that you can't avoid, so it doesn't scale. The attempt to improve on that with Sparkplug has done some good. It's added some predictability in the packet formats, but it still suffers from some of the same problems that MQTT introduces, and then introduces a couple of its own as well. And so, although each of those protocols has its good and its bad points, none of them really solves the problem entirely. So as you sort of said in your introduction, yes, we do solve these problems by borrowing a lot from OPC, by doing things in some cases very similarly to MQTT, but avoiding some of the pitfalls that each of those protocols has.
How can you keep the system secure?
Well, okay. I mentioned a couple of things, like assume that your networks are hostile. Don't assume the friendly connected network. Keep your firewalls closed. We often hear people say, oh, but our product only requires you to open one port in your firewall. And one open port is one open port too many. Really, when people think about firewall ports and say, oh, well, you're attacking a firewall port, you're not. You're attacking the program that is listening on the firewall port. And programs have memory problems, they have misfeatures and errors and bugs. And it doesn't take long for somebody to find out that that port is open and begin the process of probing that program, looking for that exploit, which then opens them up to the whole network. So firewalls should be completely closed, not just closed all but one port. I mentioned it before, there should be no direct mechanism for OT to connect it to the internet, because that just invites exfiltration. You should minimize the data that you do expose. There is an intentional exposure going on here. You want your data in the cloud. You want your data in the hands of third parties. Don't send data that doesn't need to be sent. Don't expose the whole server when you only need a few of the data points or a subset of the data points. Don't expose the data as read-write. If the end user of that data should only be able to look at it, don't make it writable. Don't even give them the opportunity to try to write back to the control system. If you are writing data back to the control system, sanity check it. Don't assume that the data is valid if it comes from an external source. Somebody might accidentally put in a set point that is 0 or far too high, and run your centrifuge a little too fast. So don't just trust the external source. And I would say most importantly is educate your humans. We've been talking about security as a technological issue, and you can go a long way with technology to add security to your system. But ultimately, the humans can be the weakest link. They're the ones who bring in that infected USB stick, or they click on the link in the email. They accidentally misconfigure the firewall so that it's more open than they intended. Everybody in the organization needs to be aware that security is important. And that requires education, constant education and repetition and reminders to ensure that the people who are in place to possibly compromise a network don't do it.
Have you heard? CSIA recently released the latest version of the Best Practices Manual 6.0. If you're unfamiliar with the BP manual, all you really need to know is that it is a crowdsourced, reiterative guide to scaling an SI business. The best part? It's written by SIs for SIs. And the bestest part? It's absolutely free to CSIA members. To learn more, visit www.controlsys.org/best practices. I truly think that you're going to be glad you did. It's quite impressive. It's super interesting to me because there must be a point at which you make it so difficult for somebody to, like, say, log in or whatever, that they end up coming up with a workaround, like they put a Post-it note on their computer or whatever to try and like bypass whatever. I mean, I'm guilty of doing that too, trying to, that two-way authentication. Ugh, stop already. So there must be a point at which you put, I guess you can't really put too much protection in place. The human element part of it is really the tricky part, right? Because people are problem solvers and they'll come up with some sort of workaround and not realize how much they could be compromising the whole system, right?
From the very beginning of time.
Yeah.
People who had passwords that were the word password exposed the system, but they didn't want to remember something complex. The issue of two-factor authentication or multiple RDP sessions, one inside the other, making this sort of a Russian stacking doll of connections just to be able to get to the control system, those are necessary. The reality is that convenience and security are inversely correlated. You cannot have security and perfect convenience at the same time. And so that's part of the education process, just to let the people who are frustrated by the security measure know how important that security measure is. People are really ingenious about getting around security measures. I worked on a system where the network security to the OT system was great. It was excellent until somebody brought in a cellular modem and just connected it to one of the machines and just bypassed everything, went straight out to their telephone provider. That's terrible. That is a huge security gap. And it's important to let people know just how important that security is and convince them to just put up with the inconvenience that imposes.
So do you think the crayon on the napkin was a little bit more secure?
It was far more secure from a data security standpoint, yes. But it lacked a little inefficiency, let's say.
So tell me another example of how there was a project that was super challenging and how you solved that customer's problem for that.
We had a very interesting problem with a customer of ours who runs a number of wind farms throughout the United States, was approached by the EPA with a mandate that they had to shut down their turbines or curtail their turbines in a certain location at a certain time of year, because that was the migratory route of some endangered bat species. And they were given 2 weeks to do it because the bats were flying in 2 weeks' time. And so our customer went to the turbine manufacturer originally and said, "This is important to us. We don't want to be on the wrong side of the EPA on this. They can shut down the whole farm. We have 2 weeks. What can you do?" And the turbine manufacturer said, "Well, if you had 6 months, maybe we could do something about that. But no, there's nothing we can do." So as it happens, our system, our software was in their system for other reasons, doing a lot of the control and the communications, both within the wind farms and across them. And so since we already had that software in place, they said, "Can you do something? You've got a scripting language. Can you do something to just help us curtail our wind turbines while those bats are in the air?" And so we had worked with the system engineer before, so we knew how he worked. We knew how to work with him. So it was possible for us to sit down and very quickly just put heads together. And within about a week and a half, we had a system that looked at the date, what time of year is it, looked at the time of day, looked at the temperature outside, looked at the wind speed, all of this coming off the turbines. And then turbine by turbine, it would shut down those that posed a threat to those bats, to the satisfaction of the EPA. And that went into place, and the farm continued to run. And that system is running still today. That's probably, I don't know, probably about 8 years ago. And that system still runs perfectly now.
I love that story. That's so great. No bats were harmed.
No, well, not that we're aware of.
What makes you optimistic about the future of the automation industry?
At the micro level, I'd say that I'm optimistic because the communication standards that we've been working with for so long are becoming more robust. We can trust them. We can trust the tools. They're being adopted with better consistency. And so we don't have the same problems we used to have. But looking forward, I think that there will be a certain amount of rallying around the few good protocols and eliminating some of the ones that really aren't necessary. And that will make it easier for all of us, both as implementers and as software developers. Sort of at the middle level, we're seeing better analysis tools come online. The mathematics around fault prediction and anomaly detection are getting better. The tools for those are more sophisticated, more automated. And so we're going to start seeing those being more democratized, where it won't just be the biggest companies with the biggest systems using those. We'll start to see everybody being able to take advantage of some of the higher level analysis tools that have been out of reach in the past. And I think back to my time doing expert systems in controls, those were very expensive systems, and it was not possible for the average user to derive advantage from those. But I think that as we move forward, that will become more available. And that is part of the movement to the cloud as well, is that these commoditized analytical systems are now available to anybody who can come up with $100 a month, rather than somebody had to come up with $100,000 to install it on his local system. And I would say at the highest level, we're seeing a lot more emphasis being placed on impact of systems. So where before there was no conversation about environmental impact, there was no conversation around a job impact of automation systems, we're now seeing a lot more of that. And personally, I support that. I think that automation systems should not just be about grinding out the most from a machine. It should be doing it in a way that is beneficial, not just to the company, but to its surroundings as well.
Looking back along your career, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give your younger self just getting started?
I mentioned earlier in the conversation how we had started off working in deterministic real-time systems, how we had invented a lot of the technology we had to use. I would say to my younger self, don't swim upstream quite so much. A lot of what we did for the first 10 years of my career in industrial controls, we invented. And there is a good reason to want to innovate, but to innovate in such a way that it fits with what's currently going on. We innovated in a way that didn't fit, that required our customers to either take our solution or take the alternate solution that was out there. And that's not a good approach, frankly. We need to innovate in a way that our solutions add to what's out there, that we can stand on the shoulders of other people's work and expand upon it, make it better, more efficient, more reliable, more secure, but not demand that the customer abandon all of their capital equipment outlay or all of their software outlay in order to be able to take that better solution. So I hate to confess it, but it took 10 years for me to reach this understanding. And I would tell my younger self, skip those 10 years.
But you learned a lot, though.
I did, but I would still skip it if I had to go back and do it again.
Boom, there goes a whole decade. Before we pop off the call here, give me some recommendations of 3 books or maybe podcasts or something that you would recommend.
There are some YouTube channels that I follow. There are some chat groups that I monitor related to industrial controls. And they are focused at least partially on marketing and pushing what I would say is an agenda. And I really hesitate to recommend those, to be honest. And so, in all fairness, I will neither name nor recommend them. So instead, what I'd like to recommend is the thing that I think our listeners least want to hear, which is if you have to read something, read the spec. And I know specifications are a hard slog, but when you're in the business of installing software and dealing with the inevitable problems that come up around the networking, around the communications, nothing beats understanding the spec to be able to identify the problem. For the most part, OPC Classic is not a hard spec to read. MQTT is very simple. Sparkplug is not difficult to read. The only big one out there that's hard to read is OPC UA. And frankly, even that, you should read the first 3 chapters, the first 3 volumes of OPC UA, at least understand what it's trying to do. And then, as necessary, add the additional 11, 12, 13 volumes that make up the entire spec. But that, to me, is the reading that anybody in industrial controls communication should do. At least read the specs that are related to the jobs that you're doing.
Are there any business management books that you would recommend? Or as a business owner, how do you keep those skills fresh?
That's a tougher question. I have read a few of the books that are out there, the standard Lee Iacocca's book and so on. We're not Chrysler.
Yeah.
A lot of his suggestions don't really apply. But as far as it goes, honestly, we're learning as we go on those ones. We talk to people. We have a very good independent board, all of whom have decades of experience in business. And so we tend to go to the people, not the books, to get that information, whether it's our CFO who's had 50 years experience, or again, our board members, each of whom has had 30 or 40 years of experience in business. That's who we look to when we need the kind of advice that would otherwise come from management books.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Talking Industrial Automation. If you are interested in learning more about Andrew or Skkynet, you can find them on the Industrial Automation Exchange at www.CSIAexchange.com. Thanks for listening, and thank you, Andrew, for joining me today.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa. I'm glad to be in here.
If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also really help the show by leaving a review and sharing with colleagues. We're all just slaves to the algorithm now, so I gotta ask. Thanks for listening to the Talking Industrial Automation podcast. Thanks also to bensound.com and Wistia for the music bumpers. Until next time.